declare Miss Billie Miller duly elected to represent the city of Bridgetown in the House of Assembly.
This was the scene outside of the auditorium of the Bethel Methodist Church, Lower Bay Street, on the night of Wednesday, May the 12th, 1976. The name Billie Miller was set to become a household name in Barbados. More than 4 decades later, if you were to enter that name in a Google search engine, you would retrieve a long list of achievements and accomplishments, including that of being the first female appointed to the cabinet of Barbados. But far beyond that, and more importantly, you would get a sense of how she used her disciplined law to improve the lot of Barbadians in her quest to leave this island better than how she found it. The autobiographical journey of Dame Billie Antoinette Miller begins now. She starts by placing things in correct perspective.
My father, Frederick Edward Miller, born on the 22nd of August, 1910. Biggest family. In those days, they had big families. There were 10 of them. My grandfather was Luther Gordon Miller, and you will find lots of Luthers and Gordons and Edwards and so on in his great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. There's always a Gordon, and there's always an Antoinette. My grandmother was Caroline Antoinette, so I have her middle name. There was a bit of argument, apparently, when I was going to be baptized at James Street Methodist Church, which is our home church. And the reverend there was, I think he was a Welshman. That's what I was told. And so my parents are standing up in front of the font, you know, godmother's holding the baby. And of course I was blissfully ignorant of everything that was going on. And so when he leaned forward and he said, and what are you naming her? So Daddy said, Billie Antoinette Miller. And an argument started. The Reverend said, but this is a girl child. He said, yes. Now my father, I'm not sure I want to detour this point to make another point. But I'll get back to that. But this argument went on. And apparently my father was he just ignored them all. Every time he asked, you know. So then, to make peace, he said, is there no girl's name that you could give her as well? So, like many of my cousins, I got my grandmother's name, which is Antoinette. But I never use it. And my name is spelled B-I-L-L-I-E. Now, it's not been ever said to me, but I have my suspicions. In those days, my father used to be in the tamarind business, where you go around the country looking for a nice-looking, heavily laden tamarind tree, especially when they're in season. And you buy a tree, not, I mean, physically the tree, but you get the crop. And he would then have a group of boys, and they would go up, shake the trees down as much as they could, and then they would fill a number of bags, you know, with these. Now, when my father met my mother, I'm going to have to do a little detour here. She was a nurse midwife at the old General Hospital. They all had to be midwives then, because that was a time when, like I said, people were having humongous families. And at that time, He rode, believe it or not, a Harley Davidson, painted bright red. It was known as the Killer because it had killed its 3 former owners. So apparently, when I was born, my mother persuaded my father. She said, please, don't sell it. Don't give it away. Disassemble it so that it cannot kill anybody else. And that is when he brought then a Chevrolet red pickup, so that the Tamarinds and so on and so forth. And he kept that for a very long time, because I can remember when a hurricane was said, a bad storm was said to be coming to Barbados, and the news was sent around to all schools and so on, get the children home. M22, that was his number, turned up at Queen's College, and my father shouted, all for Black Rock, get in. A bull rush like you can't believe. So we dropped, he dropped off people on the way because we were living at Brighton. But he used to go up to New York once a year. Once the tamarinds, the making of the tamarind business was very interesting. In the colonial days, when we were still a full colony, anybody working in the civil service, the colonial civil service, the people at the very top, like the Solicitor General and people like that and so on and so forth, they were brought in from England. But further down the ladder, they used Barbadians. And in those days, if you were a woman and you got married, and you were a member of the colonial civil service, a lot of teachers were, a lot of nurses were, well, all of them. Once they got married, they had to give it up. They had to give up their profession. No pension, no nothing. So my mother then started helping my father with the tamarind business. So the tamarinds were then brought back, and a number of women, most of them from the city and all around in New Orleans, which is how I happened to know so many people before I even dreamed that I would be running the city of Bridgetown. And they would take the shells off, and he had a huge, almost like a well, full of molasses. And there was always, it only happened once a year, the season, there was a cooper. Now, your generation would hardly know about coopers, but my generation knew them well. A man who made wooden casks, and the wood was curved, and then he used metal to hold the whole thing together, and he would be there all day long doing that while the women are shelling the tamarinds. Then the tamarinds would be put in layers with the molasses or whatever it was in between, and then shipped off. To this day, I don't know how many people realize it. I use in my kitchen, you will always find Lean Perrins. And if you look carefully on the label, you will see tamarind. Those tamarinds used to come almost exclusively from Barbados, because my Uncle Tommy, then he started up a tamarind business a little further along in Tudor Street. So there were 2 Miller brothers doing that work. And he used that money to build the house where, once he got married, my mother was his second wife. He was one of the early divorces. in Barbados. And what would happen then is that she got no pension, nothing, and so on. But she then helped him in the business. She was a lefty and always wrote with green ink. So she was a good bookkeeper. She was good at math, which I am not. But he then went into the Tamarind Business. By that time, he was very much into the politics of the time. The mid-30s, which people still refer to as the time of the Great Tribulation, there was poverty unbelievable. And then it was made worse by the fact that the Second World War was underway, and there was very little that you could import into Barbados. So we couldn't import rice. We couldn't import a lot of the basics. And then around the entire Caribbean, we discovered things that could come by the usual schooners and so on. So you couldn't import flour, and the Vincentians knew how to make cassava flour. And I see it's becoming popular again. And things like that. So you altered your life to suit it. But he became very, very engaged with the idea of politics. And Grantley Adams, as he then was, kept getting behind him. He said, Freddie, you know, it's time for you to run. At that time, there was no Barbados Labour Party. There was something called the Progressive League. And Daddy told him, I have one more thing that I must do. I must build a house for my poor starving children. That's how we were referred to. And so said, so done. He built the house in Brighton, where we grew up, Blackrock, and he ran then. In those days, all constituencies were double-member constituencies. And Daddy chose St. George, and there was Colonel Dowding. He fought in the Second World War, and he was always going to end up as the senior member because of who he was and, you know, the estates that he owned and so on. And my father would then be the junior member in St. George. And that went on until we moved away. And in 1952, when there was the beginning of the movement from the colonial style of government, then we had single-member constituencies. And he was dedicated to St. George. Everywhere we went, sometimes after Sunday school, he would give us a drive. My mother would put carpeting on the floor of the back of the pickup and a few umbrellas in case the rain came. And we would hear that we were going to go for a drive and you get all excited. But every time we went for a drive, every time it had to be via St. George. So in a way, I got to know St. George in a way that even people who ran in St. George did not know at that time. But then we went, after the attempt, the federal attempt, then a number of things changed. And eventually in 1966, we went to, the federal attempt did not last very long. I was very sorry about that. I already understood a lot of things about how the politics of Barbados worked. And because my parents took me, when there was going to be an election, my parents would take me for the canvassing. Like in the last 2 weeks, oh man, I would either be at my father's trouser leg or my mother's skirt tail. And I would just be walking around and seeing things, and a lot of things were fixing in here that they didn't even recognize. I can remember when Mr. Barrow, the late Earl Barrow, came to our house for the first time. It was a Sunday morning. My father was having his breakfast. The only time that he would have it with us. The boys were running about already, and this gentleman came in with his daughter in one of those old-time swimsuits. You all may be too young to know about those swimsuits. When the water hit it, it would weigh like a ton. They always were dark navy blue or like a dark, deep red. And there he was. He had Leslie, his daughter, on his knee. My chin was just barely coming over the top of the table. My father is having his breakfast, and this man is hitting the table and saying, "Freddie, I have to run. I have to run. I have to run." And they're talking, you know, and I'm there like looking at him and Daddy and to and fro, and I'm listening to every word. And then he left. And I said to my father, "Why does he want to be running all the time?" And my father said, "It's not," he took pains always to describe things to us, "it's not running like what you do in the yard. He wants to run like how I run in St. George." And I understood it immediately. So they ran together in St. George in 51. And I think Mr. Barrow did win in 1951, or didn't he? Anyhow, then in 56, which was the next election, you need to look that up so that I don't get it wrong.
Yes, after becoming a member of the Barbados Labour Party in 1951, now national hero, the Right Excellent Errol Walton Barrow contested that general election as a junior member with her father, and together they won the seat.
In 1956 then, we went further away from the old colonial style, and there were single member constituencies. And my father's first portfolio, in fact the only portfolio that he held, was health and social services. Social services, I mean, took in everything that you could think of. Old people. I can remember that was when the first, we didn't call them polyclinics then, that happened on my watch, but there were social centers, and the first always had to be in St. George. I remember when the red telephone booths came, the first telephone had to be Ellerton, and the district, there weren't district hospitals, there were district hospitals, but that's not what the forerunner to the polyclinic was. I don't know why it slipped away from it will come back to me.
The forerunner to the polyclinic was the health center.
So that was, it included everything, the prisons, whatever, every social services included everything else that nobody else had. And I can remember when he had to be wearing suits then, and Sir Grantley told him, "Freddie, I think it is time you buy a motor car, you know, and the pickup is not the best way that you should be driving around now." So we got all excited as children because we'd never had access to a car. He bought a car, he imported him from the United States. He's a Chevrolet man. And he was a 12-hour day. And he taught us that too. He taught us that if you wanted, because when we were driving with him or even at the dinner table and so on, he would explain all sorts of things to us, things sometimes asked for, sometimes not asked for. And I remember how he drilled this, because he used to repeat it all the time. If you want to do better than the other fellow, you have to be prepared to work harder than the other fellow and longer than the other fellow. So my father worked a 12-hour day. He listened to the BBC News on Radio Fusion, and then the pickup ran up the road. We had to get a bus. Like I said, the only time he ever picked us up from school was when that bad storm was coming. And that was how it was. So he explained all sorts of things to us. We had a big library set in mahogany, and a whole wall in the drawing room. All of the works of Shakespeare, all of the works of Charles Dickens. I have inherited that, and I have that in my study. I have all of that still. A lot of the British poets he had, and they stood up well because the covers in those days were leather. He introduced us to all sorts of things. He introduced us to, well, particularly me, to the politics. My younger brothers, he never took them. It was only ever me. And I mean, I was like, from 7 years old, the pickup would go up to Ellerton. That was his stamping ground. And Ellerton first always. And 8:20, she wasn't then Lady Adams, because Sir Grantley was not yet knighted, but she would drive her husband up. And so I would be in M22 to pick up in front of, you know, in the cab park with my mother, dozing off. And sometimes Grace Adams would come in and sit down, or my mother would go and sit down in 8:20. And, you know, they would chat. As I grew older, I would be picking up things. How campaigns ran. My father would take me to the homes of his chief canvassers in the district, you know, and if there were little children there, I would be left there to play with them until he came back. I didn't mind that at all, because, you know, they were speaking a language I could hardly understand. But I knew that it was important, and that when he went into the cabinet for the first time, we understood then the weightiness of what it was about and what self-government was about. And but he was a man of many, many interests. I think how I got my first name was that I started this and didn't finish it earlier. When he would go up to be paid for the Tamarind and so on, he would take 2 extra days and go down to Harlem. He was a saxophonist. Old E.D. Motley, Prime Minister Motley's grandfather, always used to say that he was the best saxophonist in Barbados. Now, my father had a way of naming things. His instrument was the saxophone. So he put together a group called Freddie and the Syncopators. They used to play every Saturday night at the Aquatic Club in the days when black people could not go into the club. They couldn't become members of the club. And there's a legion of stories. One night they came in, Uncle Tommy went, whatever Daddy did, Uncle Tommy wanted to do to her. And if he couldn't do it, he would still go along with him. And my grandmother would leave their supper in the oven. And so one night they came in, and Uncle Tommy opened the oven, brought the dish out. He said, "Freddie, we're in trouble, man. All ants, covered in ants." Daddy said, "Tommy, switch off the light." And they ate their supper, ants and all. But there's a name for everything. He was a sea dog. In fact, he used to be called the skipper. And there's a photograph of him in the skipper's hat and so on. He built a boat. He named everything called the Playmate. And they were getting ready to go off sailing. He thought his first port would be St. Lucia. But my grandmother called him and she said, "Freddie, please, don't take all of my boy children. Don't drown all of my boy children." He said, "Mama, don't worry about that." She was Mama and my grandfather was Paps. He said, "Don't worry about that. I'm not taking everybody. Harry is the youngest. He will be here." So they got on the boat and went off towards St. Lucia. And when they were a good ways out, Uncle Lulu apparently turned to Daddy and he said, "Freddie, I know that you told Mama that you're not taking all of us, but I think I need to tell you now. Lulu is up, Harry, he was the youngest, Harry is up under the tarpaulin." Anyhow, when they got to Castries, they had to encounter, as we all did in those days, this is the late 1920s. The harbour master was a Frenchman, because at that time, St. Lucia was very, very French. It still is. And I like that about it, I have to say. And so he came out in his, what they wore in those days, the short, just below the knee, khaki pants on top and the cork hat. So he came up and he said to them in French, "Où est le papier?" My father looked wrong at his brothers. He said, "I can only speak to you in English, but the only paper we have is the Barbados Advocate." The harbour master was not amused. And he gave it to them in French. It's a good thing they couldn't understand what he was saying. But then they had to, my father said, "I'm the captain here. And I need to call my father in Barbados." Now in those days, making a phone call was a big production. And he called and put my grandfather on the phone. And at least they had money in their pockets. And my grandfather apparently remonstrated and said, "Please, don't imprison my sons. I will send a draft to you tomorrow," which he did. And then they spent a few days there. I think the intention was that they were going to sail on to other islands, but I don't think that really came to pass. But they saw the banana boats coming in, and the women in their jeep, and big cans like that of bananas and so on going up the little gangplank to these bananas to go to the United Kingdom. Uncle Tommy, who was the shortest, in my generation, I am the shortest, they tend to be tall. He had positioned himself so that he was scotching underneath the gangplank. He hailed his brothers and said, they're not wearing anything underneath. These fellas were something else. But like I said, he was a man of many parts. So he had his band. The boat was called the Playmate. He names things. The house that I grew up in was called, of all things, Solitude. Can you imagine that? 6 children running about. I mean, 2 dogs. But that was his thing.
Memories don't leave like people do. They always stay with you. And so we conclude episode number 1 of Dame Billie Miller, Her Life in Focus, as she placed things in perspective and reintroduced us to her family. The series continues next week at the same time. I'm Sherwood McCaskey.